September 8th, 1944. A forest clearing in Belgium, just outside the village of Malmédy. A 19-year-old German soldier stands before 5 officers, his hands trembling, his face drained of color. In less than an hour, he'll be dead, executed by his own army for a crime he didn't commit. But here's what makes this execution different from all the others. This young man wasn't a deserter. He wasn't a coward. He was a victim of a system so brutal, so paranoid, that it devoured its own children without hesitation. His name was Curt Bruns. And before we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why his death represents one of the most tragic injustices of World War II, why the German military's field court-martial system was designed to terrorize its own soldiers, and why thousands of young men like Curt died not at the hands of the enemy, but at the hands of their own commanders. This is about what happens when an army values obedience over justice. And trust me, what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about military discipline. But here's what will really disturb you. Curt Bruns wasn't executed for military failure. He was executed to send a message. So what transformed this ordinary farm boy into a cautionary tale so terrifying that German soldiers would rather die fighting than face their own military justice system? The answer will chill you to your core. June 12, 1925, the small farming village of Oldenburg, Germany. A baby boy entered the world, and his parents named him Curt. His father worked the land that had belonged to the Bruns family for 3 generations. His mother tended the house and raised chickens. They were simple people, hard-working, devout, the kind of family that formed the backbone of rural Germany. Young Curt grew up surrounded by fields and forests. He learned to work before he learned to read. At 5 years old, he was feeding chickens. At 7, he was helping with the harvest. By 10, he could handle a plow almost as well as his father. School was something that happened between chores. Curt was a decent student, not brilliant, but steady. His teachers described him as quiet, obedient, respectful. He had friends in the village, boys he'd known his entire life. They'd swim in the creek during summer, hunt rabbits in winter, and dream about the future. Curt's dream was simple. He wanted to take over his father's farm someday, marry a local girl, raise children who would work the same land he'd worked. It was a modest dream, but it was his. Then Adolf Hitler came to power, and everything changed. By 1939, when Curt was 14, Germany was preparing for war. The Hitler Youth became mandatory. Curt attended meetings every week, learning to march, to salute, to recite Nazi ideology. He didn't particularly care about politics. He just wanted to farm. But you didn't question the system. You participated, or your family suffered the consequences. His father would sit at the kitchen, table after dinner, smoking his pipe, worry etched into his weathered face. He'd fought in the First World War, seen the trenches, lost friends in the mud of France. He knew what was coming, and he knew his son would be part of it. August 1943. Curt received his conscription notice. He was 18 years old. Report to the Wehrmacht training facility in Hamburg within 2 weeks. No exceptions, no appeals. His mother cried for 3 days straight. His father said nothing, just gripped Curt's shoulder with a hand made strong by decades of farm work. The message was clear. Do your duty. Survive. Come home. Curt arrived at the training facility with 200 other young men, farm boys and factory workers, students and apprentices. They were issued uniforms that didn't quite fit, rifles that had seen better days, and orders to transform themselves from civilians into soldiers in 8 weeks. The training was brutal. Up at dawn, running until you vomited, drilling until your feet bled. The instructors were veterans from the Eastern Front. Hard men with dead eyes who'd seen things these boys couldn't imagine. They screamed constantly, punished the smallest infractions with hours of extra duty, and made it clear that weakness would not be tolerated. Curt endured it. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he was steady. He followed orders. He kept his head down. He wrote letters home every week, carefully worded to pass the censors, telling his parents he was fine, the training was going well, he'd be home soon. He never mentioned the fear that kept him awake at night. October 1943. Training complete. Curt and his unit were assigned to the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This wasn't just any division. It was composed almost entirely of teenagers, boys born in 1925 and 1926, led by veteran officers and NCOs. The division's motto was swift as a greyhound, tough as leather, hard as Krupp steel. They were being prepared for the Western Front. Curt was assigned as a rifleman in the 3rd Company. His squad leader was a 17-year-old named Klaus Weber, a true believer who'd been in the Hitler Youth since he was 10. Klaus took the ideology seriously. He reported soldiers who expressed doubts. He volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. He terrified Curt. December 1943. The division was stationed in Belgium, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. The Allies would invade. It was just a question of when and where. The waiting was almost worse than combat. Days of tedious routine punctuated by moments of sheer terror when Allied bombers appeared overhead. Curt made friends with another soldier named Friedrich Hartmann, a quiet boy from Bavaria who missed his family as much as Curt missed his. They'd sit together during breaks, sharing cigarettes, talking about home, about what they'd do after the war. Friedrich wanted to be a teacher. Curt still wanted to farm. They made a pact. Whoever survived would visit the other's family, tell them their son had been brave. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The Allies landed at Normandy. Within hours, Curt's division received orders to move toward the coast. This was it. The real war was beginning. The march to Normandy was a nightmare. Allied aircraft controlled the skies. The division could only move at night, hiding in forests and barns during the day. Curt saw his first dead body on the 2nd day, a soldier from another unit, torn apart by a strafing run. He vomited in a ditch while Klaus screamed at him to keep moving. June 12, 1944. Curt's 19th birthday. He spent it in a foxhole outside Caen, listening to artillery shells scream overhead. No cake, no celebration, just the constant fear that the next shell would land directly on top of him. Friedrich gave him an extra cigarette. It was the best gift Curt had ever received. The fighting around Caen was savage. The Allies had superior numbers, superior equipment, and complete air superiority. The German forces fought with desperate ferocity, but they were being ground down day by day. Curt learned to function on no sleep. He learned to eat while shells exploded nearby. He learned to keep firing even when his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his rifle. He also learned what happened to soldiers who failed. One morning, the company was assembled to witness a field execution. A soldier named Hans Müller had been caught trying to desert. He was 18 years old, terrified, begging for mercy. The divisional court-martial had taken 15 minutes. The sentence was death. Hans was tied to a post. A firing squad of 6 soldiers was assembled. Curt wasn't selected, but he had to watch. Everyone had to watch. That was the point. The officer in charge read the sentence. Hans was crying, calling for his mother. The order was given. 6 rifles fired. Hans slumped against the ropes, blood spreading across his uniform. The officer walked over and fired a single shot into Hans's head. Then he turned to the assembled soldiers and said, "This is what happens to cowards." Remember this. Curt couldn't sleep for 3 days, July 1944. The fighting intensified. The Allies were pushing inland. German casualties were staggering. Curt's company, which had started with 120 men, was down to 47. Friedrich was still alive, but he'd changed. They all had. The boys who'd arrived in Normandy full of propaganda and naive courage were gone. What remained were exhausted, traumatized survivors who fought because the alternative was execution. The officers were changing too. As casualties mounted, as the military situation deteriorated, the field court-martial system became more aggressive. Soldiers were executed for the smallest infractions, falling asleep on watch, losing equipment, expressing doubt about victory. The message was clear. You fight until you die, or we'll kill you ourselves. August 15, 1944. Curt's unit was ordered to hold a position outside the village of Falaise. Intelligence reported Allied armor approaching. The position was indefensible. Everyone knew it. But orders were orders. They dug in and waited. The Allied attack came at dawn. Tanks, infantry, artillery, everything at once. The German position was overrun in minutes. Curt found himself separated from his unit, running through a forest, shells exploding around him. He ran until his lungs burned, until he couldn't hear the fighting anymore. Then he collapsed behind a fallen tree and tried to figure out what to do. He was lost, alone, and terrified. His rifle was gone, dropped somewhere during the retreat. He had no food, no water, no idea where his unit was. For the first time since his conscription, Curt considered deserting. He could hide in the forest, wait for the Allies to advance past him, surrender, survive. But he thought about Hans Müller tied to that post. He thought about his father's face. He thought about what would happen to his family if he was branded a deserter. So he started walking, trying to find his unit. August 17, 1944. After 2 days of wandering, Curt stumbled into a German checkpoint. He was filthy, exhausted, unarmed. The soldiers at the checkpoint immediately arrested him. Deserter. That was the assumption. It didn't matter that Curt explained what had happened. It didn't matter that he'd been trying to rejoin his unit. He was a soldier found behind the lines without his weapon. That was enough. He was placed under guard and transported to a field headquarters for court-martial. August 19, 1944. Curt's court-martial began. The proceedings took place in a commandeered farmhouse. 5 officers sat behind a table. Curt stood before them, still in his filthy uniform, hands shaking. There was no defense attorney. There were no witnesses called on his behalf. The prosecutor presented the case. Curt Bruns, age 19, found behind the lines without his weapon, suspected of desertion. The evidence was his presence at the checkpoint. That was it. That was the entire case. Curt tried to explain. He'd been separated during the retreat. He'd been trying to find his unit. He wasn't deserting. He was just lost. The presiding officer cut him off. "Where is your weapon, soldier?" "I lost it during the retreat, sir." "You lost your weapon. Do you understand that a soldier's weapon is his most sacred trust? That losing your weapon is a betrayal of your duty?" "Sir, I was under fire. I was running. I didn't mean to." "Intention is irrelevant. You lost your weapon. You were found behind the lines. These facts are not in dispute." The court-martial deliberated for 7 minutes. Curt stood outside the farmhouse, guarded by 2 soldiers with machine pistols. He could hear muffled voices through the walls, but couldn't make out words. He thought about his mother's face. He thought about the fields back home, ready for harvest. He thought about Friedrich, wondering if his friend was still alive. The door opened. Curt was brought back inside. The presiding officer stood. His face was expressionless. "Curt Bruns, this court finds you guilty of dereliction of duty and suspected desertion. The sentence is death by firing squad, to be carried out immediately. Do you have any final words? Curt's legs nearly gave out. Death. For getting lost, for losing his rifle, for surviving when he should have died. Sir, please. I wasn't deserting. I was trying to get back. Please, I have a family. My father... Your father raised a coward. Sentence will be carried out within the hour. Dismissed. Curt was dragged from the farmhouse. He was screaming now, begging, promising he'd fight harder. He'd never lose his weapon again. Please, just give him another chance. The guards ignored him. They'd heard it all before. He was taken to a clearing in the forest, the same forest where he'd hidden 2 days earlier. A post had been driven into the ground. This wasn't the first execution here. You could see the bullet holes in the wood, the dark stains in the dirt. 6 soldiers were assembled as the firing squad. They were young, probably not much older than Curt. They wouldn't meet his eyes. A chaplain approached. Would you like to pray, my son? Curt nodded. He couldn't speak. The chaplain recited the Lord's Prayer. Curt's lips moved, but no sound came out. His mind was screaming. This couldn't be happening. This was a mistake. Someone would stop it. Someone would realize he wasn't a deserter. But no one came. The guards tied him to the post. His hands were bound behind his back. His legs were shaking so badly they had to tie those too. The presiding officer approached with a piece of paper. He read the sentence again, officially, for the record. Curt barely heard it. He was looking at the sky, at the trees, at the world he was about to leave. He was 19 years old. He'd never kissed a girl. He'd never see his parents again. He'd never work the farm. All of it. Gone. Because he'd gotten lost. The officer finished reading. He stepped back. The firing squad raised their rifles. Curt closed his eyes. He thought about home. About his mother's cooking. About his father's rough hands. About the smell of fresh-turned earth in spring. The officer raised his hand. Ready? 6 rifles aimed at Curt's chest. Aim. Curt was crying now, tears streaming down his face. He whispered, Mama. Fire. 6 rifles fired as one. The impact threw Curt back against the post. Pain exploded through his chest, white-hot, all-consuming. He couldn't breathe. Blood filled his mouth. His vision was going dark. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. The bullets had hit his chest, but none had struck his heart directly. He was drowning in his own blood, dying slowly, in agony. The officer approached. He drew his pistol. This was protocol. The coup de grace. The mercy shot. He placed the barrel against Curt's temple. Curt's eyes were open, glazed with pain and terror. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. The officer pulled the trigger. Curt Bruns died in a forest in Belgium, executed by his own army for the crime of surviving. His body was cut down and buried in an unmarked grave, just another casualty of a war that devoured its children without mercy. No one notified his parents. As far as the Wehrmacht was concerned, Curt had simply disappeared. It would be months before his family received any information, and when they did, it would be a single line. Killed in action. They would never know the truth. They would never know their son had been murdered by the system he'd been forced to serve. But here's what we need to understand about Curt Bruns and the thousands like him. They were victims of a military justice system designed not to ensure fairness, but to terrorize soldiers into absolute obedience. The German field court-martial system during World War II was a weapon of terror. Between 1939 and 1945, German military courts sentenced approximately 30,000 soldiers to death. Of those, at least 20,000 were executed. Compare that to the American military, which executed exactly 1 soldier during World War II Private Eddie Slovic, for desertion. The British executed none. The disparity is staggering. The German system wasn't about justice, it was about control. As the war turned against Germany, as casualties mounted and morale collapsed, the military leadership responded with increasing brutality toward its own soldiers. Can't hold a position? Execution? Lost your weapon? Execution. Expressed doubt about victory? Execution. The message was clear. You're more likely to die from your own officers than from the enemy, so you might as well fight. Field courts-martial were deliberately designed to be swift and harsh. Trials lasted minutes, not hours. There were no defense attorneys. Evidence was minimal. The burden of proof was reversed. You were guilty unless you could prove innocence, and proving innocence was nearly impossible. Officers who presided over these courts were under pressure to demonstrate their loyalty through harsh sentences. A reputation for leniency could end a career or worse. So they sentenced young men to death for infractions that in any other army would have resulted in disciplinary action at most. And the executions were public. Soldiers were forced to watch. Sometimes they were forced to participate in the firing squads. This was psychological warfare directed at Germany's own troops. Every execution was a message. This could be you. Stay in line. Keep fighting. Die for the Reich or die by the Reich. There's no third option. Curt Bruns was caught in this machinery of terror. He wasn't a coward. He wasn't a deserter. He was a 19-year-old farm boy who got separated from his unit during a chaotic retreat and had the misfortune of being found by officers who needed to demonstrate their ruthlessness. His execution served no military purpose. It didn't improve discipline. It didn't strengthen the German position. It was simply murder dressed up as military justice. And it happened, thousands of times, to thousands of young men throughout the war. The officers who sentenced Curt to death faced no consequences. After the war, the Allied powers focused on prosecuting major war criminals, concentration camp personnel, those who'd committed atrocities against civilians. The officers who'd run the field court-martial system largely escaped justice. Many returned to civilian life, became businessmen, teachers, civil servants. They lived full lives, raised families, died peacefully in their beds. The irony is bitter. Curt Bruns, who committed no crime, was executed. The officers who murdered him lived long, comfortable lives. But here's what haunts me most about Curt's story. In his final moments, tied to that post, he wasn't thinking about ideology or duty or the Reich. He was thinking about his mother. He was thinking about home. He died calling for his mama, like the child he still was. That's the truth about war that propaganda never shows you. It's not glorious. It's not noble. It's terrified children dying in the dirt, calling for their mothers, killed by systems that view them as expendable resources rather than human beings. The survivors of Curt's unit, those who made it through the war, carried his memory. Friedrich Hartmann survived. He was captured by American forces in September 1944 and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. After the war, he kept his promise. He traveled to Oldenburg and visited the Bruns family. He told them their son had been brave. He didn't tell them about the execution. How could he? How do you tell parents that their son was murdered by his own army? So he lied. He said Curt had died in combat, quickly, without pain. It was a mercy. Perhaps the only mercy in this entire story. The Bruns family never recovered. Curt's mother died in 1947, her health broken by grief. His father worked the farm alone until he was too old to continue, then sold it to a neighbor. The land that had been in the family for generations passed to strangers. Curt's father died in 1953, and with him died the last person who remembered Curt as he really was. A quiet boy who loved the land, who dreamed simple dreams, who deserved so much better than the death he received. Today, there's a small memorial in Oldenburg. It lists the names of villagers who died in World War II. Curt Bruns' name is there, along with 47 others. There's no indication of how he died, just his name, his birth year, and his death year. 1925 to 1944. 19 years, that's all he got. But across Germany, historians and activists have been working to document the victims of military justice. They've identified thousands of soldiers executed by field courts-martial. They've pushed for official recognition that these executions were judicial murders, not legitimate military discipline. In 2002, the German government finally issued a blanket pardon for soldiers executed for desertion. Too late for Curt, too late for his family. But perhaps not. Too late for history to remember them correctly. Because that's what stories like Curt's demand from us. Remembrance. Recognition that these young men were victims, not criminals. Understanding that the real cowards weren't the soldiers who broke under impossible pressure, but the officers who sent them to their deaths to cover their own failures. The German military leadership knew they were losing the war. They knew the positions they ordered held were indefensible. They knew the attacks they ordered were suicidal. But rather than admit failure, rather than accept responsibility, they blamed the soldiers. And when blame wasn't enough, they killed them. This is the lesson of Curt Bruns. Systems of absolute authority, systems that demand unquestioning obedience, systems that punish doubt and reward brutality, these systems inevitably turn on their own. They consume the innocent along with the guilty. They create injustice in the name of order, and they leave behind graveyards full of young men who deserved better. Curt Bruns deserved better. He deserved to go home. He deserved to work his father's farm. He deserved to marry, to have children, to grow old watching the seasons change over fields he'd known his entire life. Instead, he got a bullet in a Belgian forest, executed by the country he'd been forced to serve. There's no comfort in this story, no redemption, no justice delayed but eventually delivered. Just waste. The waste of a young life, the waste of potential, the waste that war always brings, but that military injustice makes even more bitter. If there's anything to take from Curt's story, it's this. We must question authority, especially military authority. We must demand that systems of justice actually deliver justice, not just enforce obedience. We must remember that soldiers are human beings, not machines, and that breaking under impossible pressure isn't cowardice, it's humanity. And we must remember the Curt Brunses of history, the ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, who did their best, who tried to survive, who deserved compassion but received only brutality. They're easy to forget. They didn't commit atrocities that make headlines. They didn't perform acts of heroism that earn medals. They just died, quietly, unjustly, their stories buried in unmarked graves and classified files. But they deserve to be remembered, because remembering them means acknowledging that war doesn't just kill through combat. It kills through injustice, through systems that value obedience over humanity, through officers more concerned with their own authority than with the lives of the men under their command. Curt Bruns died on September 8, 1944, in a forest clearing in Belgium. He was 19 years old. He was guilty of nothing except being in the wrong place at the wrong time, serving in an army that had lost its humanity long before it lost the war. His execution was murder. The officers who ordered it were murderers, and the Volksschule system that enabled it was a crime against every young man forced to serve. That's the painful end of Curt Bruns. Not a hero's death, not a soldier's death, just murder, dressed up in military procedure, carried out by men who faced no consequences for their crimes. And if that doesn't make you angry, if that doesn't make you question every system that demands absolute obedience, then you haven't been paying attention. Remember Curt Bruns. Remember what was done to him. Remember that justice delayed for 58 years is justice that came too late. And remember that the real cowards in this story weren't the soldiers who broke under pressure. They were the officers who pulled the triggers, who gave the orders, who built a system designed to murder its own children. They're the ones who should be remembered with shame. Curt Bruns should be remembered with sorrow, with respect, and with the recognition that he deserved so much better than the death he received. His story is over, but the lessons remain, and we ignore them at our peril.